Hello and welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy this story. I'm going to try and upload a new story each day. The Siren's Curse. Chapter 1: Whispers on the Wind. Holly Arnold had lived on the Isle of Wight her entire life, as had her mother and her mother before her. The sea was in her blood, and like most women in the coastal town of Ventnor, she made her living from it. Holly was a fisherwoman, just like her mother had been, a respected figure in the community, known for hauling in the largest catches, no matter the season. But as summer waned and the autumn winds began to howl, strange things started happening in Ventnor. The once clear waters grew dark and murky, and the fish, once abundant, seemed to vanish overnight. The men in the town, fishermen by trade, blamed the weather, the tides, anything they could think of. But the women knew better. There was something unnatural about the way the sea had changed, something that made the hair on the back of Holly's neck stand on end. The first sign of trouble came with the whispers. The wind carried strange, melodic sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Holly first heard them on a calm, misty morning as she prepared her boat. At first, she thought it was just the wind playing tricks on her, but the melody was too deliberate, too hauntingly beautiful to be anything natural. The other women in the town heard it too. They would pause in their work, heads cocked, eyes distant, as if listening to something just beyond the edge of hearing. When Holly asked her mother about it, the old woman just shook her head, her face pale. "Stay away from the water," was all she said. But Holly couldn't stay away. The sea called to her in ways she couldn't explain. It was her livelihood, her sustenance, the source of everything she had ever known. And now, it seemed, it was something more. Chapter 2: The Siren's Song. One evening, after the sun had dipped below the horizon, Holly found herself drawn to the shore. The town was quiet, the only sounds the distant cries of seabirds and the gentle lapping of the waves against the rocks. But as she approached the beach, the whispers grew louder, forming a melody so entrancing that Holly felt her heart begin to race. She wasn't alone. As she stepped onto the sand, she saw other women standing at the water's edge, their faces bathed in the pale light of the moon. They were the fisherwomen of Ventnor, the wives, daughters, and mothers who had lived their lives by the sea. They stood silently, their eyes fixed on the horizon, where a figure stood out against the silver water. At first, Holly thought it was just a trick of the light, a reflection of the moon on the waves. But as she watched, the figure moved, gliding across the surface of the water with an unnatural grace. She was tall and slender, her hair flowing like seaweed in the current. Her eyes were dark, as deep and unfathomable as the ocean itself, and her voice was like nothing Holly had ever heard. It was a siren. The stories had been passed down for generations, tales of a beautiful, otherworldly creature who lived in the depths of the sea, luring sailors to their doom with her song. But those were just stories, fairy tales to frighten children. Or so Holly had thought. But now, standing on the shore, listening to that haunting melody, Holly knew the truth. The siren was real, and she was calling to them. Holly tried to resist, but the pull was too strong. She stepped forward, her feet sinking into the wet sand as she moved closer to the water. The other women did the same, their movements slow and dreamlike, as if they were in a trance. The siren's song grew louder, more insistent, and Holly felt her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to run, to turn and flee back to the safety of her home, but she couldn't. The siren had her in her grasp, and there was no escaping it. As she reached the water's edge, the siren's voice filled her mind, drowning out all other thoughts. It was a voice of unimaginable beauty, promising peace, happiness, and an end to all suffering. All she had to do was step into the water to give herself to the sea. And she did. Chapter 3: The Bargain. The water was cold, but Holly barely felt it. She waded in, the waves lapping at her legs, pulling her deeper and deeper into the ocean. The other women followed, their faces blank, their eyes glazed as they walked into the sea. As the water reached her waist, Holly saw the siren more clearly. She was breathtakingly beautiful, her skin shimmering like pearls, her hair floating around her like a dark halo. But there was something wrong, something that made Holly's heart clench with fear. The siren's eyes, though beautiful, were empty. They held no warmth, no kindness, only a deep, unending hunger. Holly realized too late that the siren's promises were lies. There would be no peace, no happiness, only death. But it was too late. The siren reached out her fingers, long and slender, tipped with sharp, black nails. She touched Holly's cheek, and Holly felt the coldness seep into her bones, freezing her from the inside out. "You belong to me now," the siren whispered. "You will serve me, as all the others have." Holly tried to speak, to plead, but her voice was gone. She felt herself sinking, the water closing over her head, pulling her down into the dark depths of the ocean. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was the siren's smile, a cruel, twisted thing that promised nothing but pain. Chapter 4: The Curse. Holly woke to the sound of waves crashing against the shore. She was lying on the beach, the cold sun clinging to her skin. For a moment she thought it had all been a dream, a nightmare brought on by the stress of the dwindling fish stocks and the strange changes in the sea. But then she looked around. The other women were there, lying in the sand, their eyes wide open, staring up at the sky with blank, unseeing eyes. Holly scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding as she realized the truth. They were dead. All of them. But she wasn't. She was alive, and she had no idea why. She remembered the siren's touch, the coldness that had filled her, and the last words the creature had spoken. "You will serve me." The siren had spared her, but at what cost? She turned and ran, her feet slipping on the wet sand as she fled the beach. She didn't stop until she reached her home, slamming the door behind her, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She collapsed onto the floor, her body trembling as she tried to make sense of what had happened. The siren had taken the others, their lives snuffed out like candles in the wind. But Holly was still here, still alive, and that meant something terrible. Over the next few days, Holly noticed changes. Her skin grew paler, her eyes darker, her hair lost its luster, turning brittle and dry. She could no longer eat the food she once loved, the taste of it turning to ash in her mouth. But worst of all was the voice. The siren's voice, always in her head, whispering, commanding, urging her to return to the sea. Holly tried to resist, but it was no use. The siren's will was stronger than her own, and she found herself walking to the shore every night, drawn to the water like a moth to a flame. And each night the sea called to her, the siren's song filling her mind, driving her to the edge of madness. Holly knew she couldn't keep resisting. The siren had claimed her, body and soul, and it was only a matter of time before she would have to obey. Chapter 5: The Final Descent. One stormy night, Holly could fight no longer. The siren's voice was louder than ever, drowning out all other thoughts. She left her home, the wind howling around her as she made her way to the shore. The waves were wild, crashing against the rocks with a fury that matched the storm in her heart. The other women were waiting for her, their pale faces illuminated by the flashes of lightning. They were no longer alive, but they weren't dead either. They were something else, something that the siren had created, twisted, and remade in her image. Holly felt the tear slip down her cheek as she realized her fate. She had no choice. The siren had chosen her, and there was no escape. As she stepped into the water, she felt the coldness seep into her bones once more, but this time she didn't fight it. She let it consume her, the siren's voice filling her mind, telling her what to do, how to serve. And so Holly Arnold, the last of the fisherwomen of Ventnor, gave herself to the sea. She walked into the waves, the water rising around her until it swallowed her whole. The town of Ventnor never saw Holly again. The women who had gone to the shore that night were never found, their bodies lost to the depths of the ocean. Chapter 6: The Return. Months passed, and the disappearance of the women became a grim legend in Ventnor. The town's men, desperate and grieving, took to the sea in search of answers, but they found nothing. The ocean, vast and unforgiving, offered no clues, no bodies, and no solace. The villagers spoke in hushed tones of the curse that had befallen them, of the strange events that had led to the loss of their wives, mothers, and daughters. But no one dared speak openly of the siren. She was a whispered fear, a nameless dread that lingered in the air like the salt spray of the sea. Without the women, life in Ventnor became a shadow of what it had once been. The men struggled to manage both their homes and their boats, their hearts heavy with loss. The sea, which had once been a source of life and livelihood, was now a graveyard of memories. And yet it called to them still, as it always had, its waves whispering promises they no longer believed. One cold, misty morning, as the sun struggled to rise over the horizon, the sea finally gave back what it had taken. The first to notice was old Thomas Wright, a fisherman who had lived on the Isle of Wight for over 70 years. He was the last of his line, his sons lost to the sea, and his wife, Mary, among the missing women. His old heart had hardened over the months, bitter with grief, and so he went to the shore each day, hoping that the sea would finally claim him too. But on that morning, as he gazed out over the mist-covered waves, he saw something moving in the water. At first, he thought it was just debris, a piece of driftwood caught in the current. But as it drew closer, his blood ran cold. It was a woman. She was walking out of the sea, her pale skin glistening with water, her dark hair clinging to her shoulders like strands of kelp. She moved with a grace that was both eerie and unnatural, her steps slow and deliberate, as if she were not quite human. But her face was what struck Thomas the hardest. It was Holly Arnold. Thomas staggered back, his breath catching in his throat. Holly had been one of the first to vanish, and yet here she was, emerging from the sea as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, something terrible. Her eyes, once vibrant and full of life, were now dark and hollow like the deep, empty depths of the ocean. "Holly," Thomas whispered, though he knew she wouldn't answer. She stepped onto the shore, water streaming from her dress, and looked at him with those empty eyes. But she didn't speak. Instead, she walked past him, her movements stiff, almost mechanical, as if she were being guided by an invisible hand. Thomas watched, frozen with fear, as she made her way toward the village. Chapter 7: The New Order. The sight of Holly sent shockwaves through Ventnor. The men gathered in the square, fear and hope warring in their hearts as they beheld the woman they had thought lost forever. But their relief quickly turned to horror as they realized that something was very, very wrong. Holly wasn't the only one who had returned. One by one, the other women began to emerge from the mist, their wet hair plastered to their faces, their clothes soaked through. They moved with the same eerie grace, their expressions blank, their eyes dark and lifeless. There were no joyful reunions, no tearful embraces, only a deep, creeping dread that settled over the town like a shroud. The men tried to speak to them, to reach out to their wives, their sisters, their daughters, but the women did not respond. They walked silently past their loved ones, their gazes fixed on something far beyond the mortal world. It was as if they no longer recognized the people they had once loved. The women made their way to the shore and stood in a line, facing the sea. The wind picked up, and the whispers began again, those haunting, melodic sounds that had first called them to the water. This time, however, the men could hear them too, and their fear deepened as the song wove its way into their minds, insidious and relentless. Holly stood at the center of the line, her back straight, her hands clasped in front of her. She was the leader now, the one chosen by the Siren to carry out her will. The men watched in helpless terror as Holly raised her arms, her voice rising in a chant that echoed across the water. The other women joined in, their voices blending into a single, unified song that filled the air with a terrible beauty. The sea responded, its waves growing stronger, crashing against the rocks with a thunderous roar. The men could feel the power of the Siren, the ancient, malevolent force that had claimed their wives and now sought to take them as well. But Holly's chant wasn't just a song, it was a call to action. The men, unable to resist the pull of the Siren's power, found themselves walking toward the water, their movements slow and halting, as if they were fighting against an invisible tide. They struggled, trying to resist the Siren's call, but it was no use. The women's song had ensnared them, just as it had ensnared their wives before them. The first man to reach the water was Samuel, a burly fisherman with a heart as big as his frame. He had lost his wife, Abigail, to the sea, and now he found himself drawn to the same fate. As his feet touched the water, he looked back at Holly, his eyes pleading for mercy, for understanding. But there was none to be found. Holly's eyes remained dark and empty, her face devoid of any emotion. She raised her hand, and Samuel's body stiffened, his movements becoming more rigid as he walked deeper into the water. The sea welcomed him, pulling him under the waves, dragging him down into its depths. One by one, the men of Ventnor followed, their bodies disappearing beneath the water, claimed by the Siren's curse. The sea swallowed them whole, leaving only ripples behind, as if they had never existed. Chapter 8: The New Dawn. The sun rose over Ventnor the next morning, casting a pale light over the quiet town. The storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and clear, but there was an eerie stillness that hung over the village. The men were gone, taken by the sea, and only the women remained. Holly stood at the edge of the shore, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the first rays of sunlight touched the water. The other woman stood behind her, silent and unmoving, their eyes reflecting the same darkness that had consumed Holly's soul. The Siren's curse had been fulfilled. The women of Ventnor had paid the price, their lives forever altered by the ancient power that ruled the sea. They were no longer human, no longer bound by the rules of the mortal world. They were something else now, something that served the will of the Siren. As the first light of day spread across the ocean, Holly felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. The Siren's voice was quiet now, a soft murmur in the back of her mind, but it was always there, guiding her, shaping her thoughts. She knew what she had to do. Turning away from the sea, Holly walked back toward the village. The other women followed, their footsteps silent on the sand. The town was theirs now, empty and abandoned, a ghostly reminder of what had once been. But it wouldn't stay that way for long. The Siren's curse had spread beyond the shores of Ventnor, carried on the wind, whispered through the waves. Other towns along the coast would soon feel the pull, drawn by the same haunting melody that had claimed Ventnor. The women of the Isle of Wight would rise, their hearts bound to the sea, their souls claimed by the Siren. And Holly Arnold, the first and the last of the fisherwomen of Ventnor, would lead them. She was the Siren's chosen, her voice the conduit for the ancient power that had awoken from its slumber. As she walked through the empty streets of the town she once called home, Holly felt a dark satisfaction settle in her chest. The Siren's curse was only beginning. Epilogue: the endless tide. Years passed, and the Isle of Wight became a place of whispered legends and fearful tales. The story of Ventnor spread far and wide, though few believed it. Fishermen spoke of the strange lights that danced on the water at night, of the eerie songs that carried on the wind. Some claimed to have seen the women walking the shores at dusk, their faces blank, their eyes filled with an otherworldly darkness. But no one dared to venture too close. The sea around the Isle of Wight grew treacherous, the waves churning with a hidden fury. Boats that ventured too close were never seen again, their crews lost to the depths. The island, once a thriving hub of fishing and trade, became a place to be avoided, a cursed land where the sea claimed all who dared to challenge its power. And at the center of it all was Holly Arnold. She stood on the cliffs overlooking the sea, her dark eyes scanning the horizon, waiting for the next soul to be claimed. The Siren's song was always with her, a constant, insistent whisper that filled her mind, driving her to do its bidding. But Holly no longer fought it. She had accepted her fate, embraced the darkness that had consumed her. She was a thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please don't forget to like, and even better, like and subscribe. Thank you very much, and I hope you have had or have a great day.